The courthouse door banged open, and Timothy Grant found himself stepping into a blur of flashing emergency lights. The moment he crossed that threshold, the thunderous echo of the gavel and the shocked whispers of the courtroom seemed to fade into the distance. His heart raced faster with every step. An officer had shouted for his help just a second earlier, though Timothy still didn't understand why. Outside the main courtroom, a narrow hallway bustled with people pressed against the walls. Their faces were painted with worry or confusion. Some clutched at their phones, dialing friends or family members who might still be inside. Others simply stared at the paramedics kneeling over the woman who had collapsed moments ago. Timothy recognized the woman by her neat suit and the panic he had seen on her face when she charged into the courtroom. He wasn't sure who she was exactly, but he sensed she'd come to defend him or at least bring new information that might help his case. 2 paramedics hovered over her. One was checking her pulse and shining a small flashlight into her eyes. The other prepared a stretcher. A small cluster of people formed a semicircle, desperate to see what was happening, but also fearful of getting too close. Timothy stepped forward, dog tags still in his hand. He felt that old instinct rising in him, the duty to help someone in distress. The training he'd had in the military was never truly forgotten, even if his life had taken a rough turn once he came back home. A tall police officer spotted Timothy and beckoned him over. "She was asking for you," the officer said, sounding confused, but also urgent. Timothy's brows furrowed. Why would this woman, who looked like some kind of legal professional, ask for him by name? Glancing down, Timothy saw her eyelids flutter open, and her lips moved soundlessly. She's breathing, but her heartbeat is irregular on. A of the paramedics murmured. "We need to get her to the hospital." Timothy knelt beside the stretcher. The woman's eyes fixed on him for a brief moment. Her pupils were dilated with what looked like pain and fear. She tried to speak, but only a raspy whisper came out. Leaning closer, Timothy listened carefully. Her voice trembled as she spoke his name, Mr. Grant Tim. The air around them seemed to tighten, as though everyone in that hallway was holding their breath just to hear what she had to say. You need your records," she managed, her face pale and drawn. "I have them. The judge has to see." Then her eyelids slid shut again, and the paramedics quickly lifted her onto the stretcher, strapping her in for transport. Timothy blinked, confusion washing over him. "My records," he repeated. Did she mean his service records? The ones that proved everything about his time in the military? The ones that showed how he'd been injured and honored with multiple medals? The paramedics rushed her down the hallway, the wheels of the stretcher squeaking on the tile floor. Timothy hesitated, not sure if he was allowed to follow, but the officer who had called him pointed, urging him forward. "Go with them. She asked for you. We can clear it with the judge later." Behind Timothy, Judge Browning appeared at the doorway of the courtroom, still wearing his robe. He looked conflicted, part concern for the woman, part bewilderment over how his day had unraveled so quickly. His stern features were softened by the obvious guilt he still wore like a heavy cloak. Just minutes ago, he had been shouting at Timothy, declaring him a nuisance to society. Now he had to face the truth that Timothy was a decorated war veteran, and there was more to Timothy's story than he ever imagined. But Timothy didn't have time to linger. He followed the stretcher and paramedics, weaving through the hallway until they burst out into the bright light of the midday sun. A red and white ambulance idled at the curb, its lights flashing. Spectators caught employees, lawyers, random passers-by gathered around in small clusters, whispering and speculating. Timothy could sense their eyes on him. Some seemed to recognize him as the homeless man from inside, the one the judge had lashed out at. The woman was lifted into the ambulance. One of the paramedics paused to look at Timothy. "Are you coming?" "She wants you near," he said. Timothy nodded, though he was more than a little unsure. He climbed in, taking a seat on a small bench beside her. As soon as the doors slammed shut, the siren began to wail, and the ambulance sped away from the courthouse. Timothy's stomach churned with nerves. He never liked being in enclosed spaces like this, but that old sense of duty told him he had to be here. He had to at least try to comfort her, even if he didn't fully understand her connection to his case. She had come into the courtroom with that urgent folder of documents, the same folder she had tried to show to Judge Browning. Timothy recalled that she had told the judge there was more to his story, something about the VA hospital and the complications he'd been facing. Could it be that she was an advocate or a social worker who found out about his situation? As the ambulance sped on, the paramedic checked her vital signs. Another tried to talk to Timothy. Did she say anything to you? Anything about her condition? Timothy shook his head. She only managed to say something about my records that the judge had to see them. Both paramedics exchanged a glance. She might have had a panic or anxiety attack or something more serious, but we won't know until the doctors run tests. One paramedic explained. Ed. Timothy did his best not to let panic show on his face. He had been through worse, he reminded himself. He'd been on rescue missions in hostile territory, survived mortar fire, and endured nights in freezing foxholes. Yet something about seeing this woman, a total stranger who seemed so determined to help him, lying here helpless made his heart pound. He felt grateful, confused, and worried all at once. By the time they reached the hospital, the woman was more stable. She had regained some colour in her cheeks, but she was still too weak to speak properly. Nurses and doctors whisked her into an examination room. Timothy was left standing in the hallway, uncertain if he should stay or go. He clutched his dog tags in one hand and ran his fingers through his tangled hair with the other, trying to steady his thoughts. Part of him wanted to return to the courtroom to finish his hearing, but he also felt responsible for this woman who had specifically asked for him. He looked around at the bright hospital walls, the floors that smelled faintly of disinfectant. People in scrubs hurried back and forth, carrying clipboards, pushing wheelchairs, or guiding patients. Timothy's heart gave a small, painful jolt as he remembered the times he had come to the VA hospital with injuries. He recalled the endless forms, the lines, the times he felt lost in the bureaucracy. A voice jolted him from his thoughts. "Hey, are you Timothy Grant?" Turning, he saw a nurse approaching, her expression curious but kind. When Timothy nodded, she said, "That woman you came in with, her name is Lisa Harper. She's been asking for you again." Then the nurse led him to a curtained area in the emergency room. Lisa lay propped up on pillows, hooked to an IV drip. Though she looked fragile and tired, her eyes were sharp when she saw Timothy. She gestured weakly for him to come closer. The nurse closed the curtain to give them some privacy. Lisa took a slow breath. "I'm sorry this happened," she said, her voice rasping. "I didn't mean to cause such a scene. I had to get those documents to the judge. I found out at the last minute that you were being charged with trespassing, and no one realized you were a veteran with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, all these honors." She paused to catch her breath, pressing a hand against her chest. Timothy swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. You know about my medals?" he asked softly. It had been so long since anyone acknowledged them. He used to keep them in a small box, once proud of his accomplishments. But as life wore him down, the medals felt more like memories of a dream he could never get back. Lisa nodded. "Yes. I'm part of a group of attorneys that works with homeless vets who've fallen through the cracks. Someone at the VA recognized your name, saw that you got arrested for trespassing, and contacted me. I came to the courthouse with your files, the ones that show everything you did, including your honorable discharge and medical complications that were never resolved." Timothy was at a loss for words. He felt a surge of both relief and sadness, remembering his struggles with paperwork, how each day it got harder to keep track of forms and deadlines while living on the street. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes burning. Lisa managed a faint smile. "I'm sorry the stress of running into that courtroom, seeing the judge shouting at you, and the tension. I guess my heart couldn't handle it for a moment. But I'm okay now. Just need to rest." She coughed, and Timothy placed a comforting hand near hers, careful not to touch her IV lines. A few minutes later, the nurse popped back in, checking Lisa's vitals. Timothy took that moment to ask if it was possible for him to leave and return to the courthouse. But Lisa insisted, "No, let them come to us." "I don't need you going back there unrepresented. Call my office. Have someone tell the judge that the documents he needs are here." Timothy furrowed his brow. "But the judge is going to think I ran away. That might make things worse." Lisa shook her head gently on the pillow. "Trust me, I'll make sure the judge understands. You weren't running. You came here because I needed help. You also came here because I asked for you. That's completely different from skipping out on a hearing. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a few calming breaths. The nurse whispered that Lisa should rest. Reluctantly, Timothy stepped out of the room to give her some space. Every moment he battled the anxiety that gnawed at him. The words from Judge Browning still echoed in his mind, calling him disrespectful, a drain on the city. Yet now the judge knew at least some portion of the truth. Would that change anything? Or would the judge still see him as a homeless man who broke the law? A few hours passed. Timothy stayed in a small waiting area near Lisa's room. He watched the clock on the wall, each tick feeling like an eternity. Eventually, he drifted off to a light sleep, haunted by half-formed dreams of desert landscapes and raging gunfire. Memories he had tried to bury floated to the surface. The day he earned his Bronze Star for protecting his squad under ambush, the time he helped evacuate wounded soldiers during a night raid, the crowd's cheers upon his return home, the tears of his mother when he stepped off the plane. Then, the slow, painful collapse of his life afterward, jobs lost, medical bills unpaid, drifting from one cheap apartment to another until he ended up on the streets. He woke with a start as an officer in uniform tapped his shoulder. Timothy jolted upright. "Your presence is requested," the officer said in a neutral tone. The officer's eyes flicked briefly to Timothy's dog tags B-foe, clearing his throat. "Judge Browning is on his way here." Timothy's stomach tightened. The judge was coming here? To the hospital. Standing, Timothy rubbed his tired eyes. He felt a wave of panic welling up. What if the judge was furious? What if he demanded that Timothy return to jail right away? But the officer didn't look angry. If anything, he seemed nervous. "He'll be here soon," the man added, before stepping back into the hallway. Within 10 minutes, Timothy found himself facing Judge Browning in the hospital corridor. The judge's face was grim, but no longer hateful. He seemed weighed down by something new, remorse or sorrow, perhaps. Beside him stood the assistant prosecutor, who had discovered Timothy's records in court. They both regarded Timothy with measured expressions. Judge Browning cleared his throat. "Mr. Grant," he began, his voice lower than before, "I'm sorry for what happened in the courtroom today. I was out of line, and I let my temper get the better of me." His gaze slid away, as if he couldn't quite meet Timothy's eyes. Timothy said nothing, simply nodding. He wasn't sure what to say. The assistant prosecutor piped up. "We have the records Miss Harper was going to present. I've reviewed them, and so has His Honor." She paused to straighten a few sheets of paper on her clipboard. "We see now that you served with distinction and have multiple commendations. The documents also indicate you were discharged due to injuries and ongoing mental health challenges." Timothy swallowed hard, flashes of pain and sleepless nights flickering in his mind. He stood silent, waiting. Judge Browning took a breath and let it out slowly. "I did not realize, Mr. Grant, that your situation was this complicated. We also learned that you had been trying to get assistance through the VA but kept running into red tape. The city has not done a good job of providing alternatives for homeless veterans." The hallway was quiet, except for the beeping monitors and occasional footsteps of hospital staff. Timothy felt a tear slip down his cheek. He'd lived with shame for so long that he never thought he would hear a judge speak words like these, not for him, not in his defense. "I won't pretend it excuses trespassing," the judge continued more softly, "but I can see you were left with very few choices. A person who risked his life for our country shouldn't be sleeping in dangerous places with nowhere else to go. I can't fix everything that happened to you, Mr. Grant, but I can do something to help now." Timothy opened his mouth to speak, but only managed a shaky, "Thank you." Just then, a soft moan came from behind the partially open door to Lisa's room. Timothy, the judge, and the assistant prosecutor looked over. One of the nurses waved them closer, whispering, "She's awake." Timothy led the way. Lisa lay there, pale but more alert, and she forced a small smile. Judge Browning removed his robe, folding it over his arm as if stepping away from his official persona. "Miss Harper," he greeted her with concern. "How are you feeling?" Lisa nodded weakly. "Better." she whispered, though her voice was still strained. Then she turned her gaze to Timothy. I'm so glad you stayed. The documents, are they in your hands now? Judge Browning tapped the folder under his arm. Yes, Miss Harper. We've looked them over. Your client Timothy is going to be treated fairly. I give you my word. He paused, his eyes shifting from Lisa to Timothy. I promise. We'll handle this in a way that respects everything you have done for our country, Mr. Grant, he said. The tension in Timothy's chest loosened, replaced by a cautious relief. Lisa closed her eyes, a tear forming on her lashes. It was as if she had been carrying the weight of Timothy's case alone, and now she could finally let go. For a moment, the four of them, Timothy, Judge Browning, the assistant prosecutor, and Lisa, were bound by a sense of relief and regret, all swirling together. Though Timothy still worried about what came next, he sensed a shift in the air, as if a new path was opening. At that moment, the overhead lights flickered, and a nurse came in to check on Lisa. Judge Browning gestured for Timothy to step outside for a moment. In the hallway, he spoke in a low tone. I can't promise everything will be simple, but I will ensure that instead of jail time, you're given help through the Veterans Outreach Program, housing assistance, and medical treatment. We'll have to go through some paperwork, of course, but if you're willing to work with us, we can help you get back on your feet. Timothy felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. I'll do whatever it takes, he murmured. He thought of how he once served under strict discipline, how he'd learned to follow orders and stay strong under pressure. Maybe now those same qualities would help him find a better place to live, a steady job, and some stability. Judge Browning gave a small nod. We'll hold a more formal hearing soon, to dismiss the charges or reduce them significantly. But I need you to check in with the assigned social worker, keep all your appointments, and follow any requirements set by the VA. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Timothy said. His voice wavered, a mix of humility and relief. He never imagined the judge who had berated him so harshly would speak to him with such understanding. Just then, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Another officer approached, looking slightly panicked. Judge Browning, he called. We have a situation at the courthouse. The man who tried to attack Mr. Grant earlier is demanding to be released. He's been making all kinds of accusations, saying Timothy is a con artist. We're trying to calm him down, but he's causing a disturbance. He keeps yelling that no one should believe Timothy's story. Timothy felt his stomach lurch. He remembered that man in the jacket, lunging across the courtroom with pure anger in his eyes, yelling that Timothy was a faker. A fresh surge of fear mingled with frustration. It felt like every time a door opened for him, someone else tried to slam it shut. Judge Browning's face tightened. I'll handle it. I'll be back at the courthouse soon. Then he looked at Timothy, his tone serious but calm. Wait here at the hospital for a while. I'll send the social worker, and we'll sort the rest out once Miss Harper is stable. Don't worry about that troublemaker. He won't hold any power over you once we have all the facts on record. Timothy nodded, but his heart still pounded. The judge turned to leave, his robe draped over his arm, the assistant prosecutor following behind. Together they marched off down the hall, presumably to deal with the commotion that had flared back at the courthouse. Alone again in the white-walled corridor, Timothy sighed. He felt as though he had just climbed a giant hill, only to see another obstacle ahead. Yet, for the first time in many months, maybe years, he felt a tiny spark of hope. The memory of the judge's apology and offer of help lingered in his mind. He walked back to the waiting room, sinking into a plastic chair. Outside the window, the sun was still high in the sky, but the day had taken so many sharp turns that it felt more like dusk. His stomach rumbled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since the cheap burrito from the night before. He quietly wondered if the hospital might spare some food. He had grown used to ignoring hunger pangs, but right now the ache felt sharper than usual. A half-hour later, a young woman in a tidy blouse approached him. Mr. Grant, she asked softly. My name is Stephanie. I'm a social worker assigned to your case. Judge Browning asked me to come meet you. She offered a polite smile. We can talk in one of the private consultation rooms, if you'd like. Timothy followed Stephanie down the hallway into a small room with a table and 2 chairs. It reminded him of an interview room, but the atmosphere was gentler. She invited him to sit, and then she opened up a laptop. First, "I'm so sorry for what you've been through," she began. "We've reached out to the local Veterans Outreach Center, and they can set you up with temporary housing. I'd like to make sure you have a safe place to sleep tonight." The words safe place echoed in Timothy's mind, almost too good to be true. He nodded, holding back the urge to cry from relief. "Yes, I'd appreciate that." Stephanie typed a few things into her laptop, then produced a form. "This is just your basic information. Name, date of birth, any immediate medical needs. We'll also see if we can reconnect you with your VA medical benefits." She slid the paper toward him. Timothy picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly. For so long, any time he picked up a form, it led nowhere. But this time felt different. It took a good 20 minutes to get through all the boxes and questions, but Stephanie was patient, guiding Timothy through parts he didn't understand. He hesitated when it asked for an emergency contact. He had no one. His mother had passed away, and he'd lost touch with old friends. Finally, he left it blank, feeling a stab of loneliness. Stephanie seemed to notice, but she didn't pry. Instead, she gently guided him to the next question. When they finished, Stephanie said, "All right, that's enough for now. Let's check on Lisa Harper before I coordinate with the Veterans Outreach team." "I've heard she's stable." Timothy nodded, following her back out into the hallway. Outside Lisa's room, they found a doctor stepping out, looking weary but satisfied. "She's doing better," he informed them. "Likely just a fainting episode from exhaustion and stress. She'll probably be released tomorrow, but we're keeping her overnight for observation." Timothy felt immense relief. Stephanie encouraged him to slip inside for a quick hello. Lisa was awake, sipping some water. She raised her eyebrows in greeting. Even though she looked pale, she had a determined glint in her eye. Timothy approached the bedside quietly. "Thank you for staying," she said, her voice stronger than before. "I spoke briefly with the judge by phone. He mentioned that your case will be handled with more compassion from now on, and that the assistant prosecutor will file a motion to reduce the charge to something minor, if not dismiss it entirely." Timothy sank into a nearby chair. I can't believe it," he breathed, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Thank you for what you did. You put your own health on the line running to that courtroom." Lisa gave a tiny smile, shrugging. "It was worth it. Veterans deserve better. You deserve better." Stephanie cleared her throat softly. "Timothy, we should get going soon so we can finalize your place at the temporary shelter tonight." Timothy nodded, turning back to Lisa. "I'll visit if you need anything. Or, if you just want company." Her eyes brightened. "I'd like that. But for now, go get some rest. You've been through enough." With that, Timothy stepped outside. Even the hospital's fluorescent lights seemed gentler than the harsh glares of the city streets he'd grown used to. In just a matter of hours, so much had changed. The possibility of a safer place to sleep, real help from the court system, and an end to the humiliating cycle of scorn and suspicion, these all felt almost unreal. Yet here he stood, on the threshold of a new chapter in his life. As Timothy and Stephanie prepared to leave the hospital, a crash of thunder sounded from beyond the glass doors at the main entrance, where storm clouds gathered. Rain was about to come pouring down. For Timothy, the rain usually meant damp cardboard, cold nights, and shivers that kept him awake until dawn. Now he had the hope of a clean bed waiting somewhere else. The sound of thunder wasn't as frightening this time. Just before they exited, Stephanie's phone chimed. She glanced at it and frowned. The judge just sent a text. "That man who caused trouble earlier is making more threats outside the courthouse. The police have it under control." But she paused, looking at Timothy. "He's still determined to prove you're not who you say you are. The judge wants us to be careful." A shiver ran up Timothy's spine. Fear twisted his stomach. Would this man's rage follow him wherever he went? Or would the truth be enough to quiet him? Stephanie touched Timothy's arm reassuringly. "Don't worry. The police won't let him come near you, and he has no proof to back up his claims. You have the documents, the medals, and your VA records. Truth is on your side. Timothy gave her a grateful nod, though he couldn't help the uneasy feeling swirling in his chest. Stephanie pressed a button on the automatic doors, and they slid open. Rain pelted the pavement outside in thick sheets, bouncing off the sidewalk and forming puddles. Together, they dashed across the wet parking lot and into Stephanie's car. She cranked the ignition, turning on the windshield wipers. The rhythmic swish of the wipers against the glass felt almost soothing. As they pulled out, thunder rumbled once more, and lightning lit up the sky. Timothy stared at the bright flashes, his mind racing with thoughts of everything that happened that day. The humiliating scolding in court, the sudden reveal of his veteran status, the chaos with the attacker, Lisa collapsing, the hospital, and now Thizzen, uncertain but hopeful path. Stephanie drove carefully through the downpour, eventually turning onto a narrow street lined with tall, old buildings. "We're almost there," she said. "It's not fancy, but it's safe and dry, and the staff will help you get settled." Timothy exhaled, chest tight with a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. They pulled up in front of a 3-story building with peeling white paint. A small sign read, "Veterans Transitional Housing." Warm light glowed in the windows, inviting in a way that Timothy hadn't felt in a long time. Before he stepped out of the car, Stephanie gently touched his shoulder. "Remember, you're not alone. We're going to help you fix this, and tomorrow, well, go back to court for whatever next steps we need to take, but hopefully in a calmer way." Timothy offered a small smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, then slipped out into the rain, sprinting to the entrance. Inside, a middle-aged man wearing a volunteer's vest greeted him. With a warm handshake and a welcoming grin, the volunteer said, "Let's find you a room, Mr. Grant." Timothy followed him down a hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant, but felt far safer than any alley or underpass he'd known. A wave of gratitude swept through Timothy as he realized that tonight, at least, he would sleep with a roof over his head. But his relief was haunted by one lingering worry. That enraged stranger who had tried to attack him in court, and who was still stirring trouble, even now. And that was when, just as Timothy's hand touched the doorknob of his new room, Stephanie's phone rang again from outside in the hallway. The muffled ring sounded urgent. Timothy paused, turning back. Through the thin walls, he could hear her answering with a nervous tone. "Wait, are you sure?" "Where exactly?" "Oh no. Okay, keep me updated." "Well, lockdown, we need to..." Timothy stepped out of the room just as Stephanie ended the call, her face pale. She looked up at him with a worried expression. "The man from the courthouse is outside. He's demanding the staff let him in. He claims you're inside." Fear jolted Timothy so hard that his heart felt like it would leap out of his chest. A rush of questions filled his mind. Was this man armed? Would he try to hurt Timothy, or the innocent people here? Stephanie quickly moved toward the front door of the building. "I'll talk to the staff and call the police. You stay here." The volunteer's face blanched with concern as he locked the entrance door, peering through a small window into the rain-soaked street. Timothy's mind spun. Couldn't this nightmare end? A moment ago he felt the warmth of hope, but now an even greater storm brewed outside. With lightning splitting the sky, thunder roaring, and a furious stranger pounding on the door, Timothy couldn't tell if he was caught in a flashback from his combat days or living some surreal new battle right here at home. And so, Chapter 2 ended with the echo of fists hammering on the locked door, the shrill ring of Stephanie's phone, and Timothy's heart pounding like a drum in his ears. Somewhere beyond those walls, a rage-filled figure refused to let go, demanding to see the very man who had just begun to hope again. The question hung like a storm cloud in the room. Would this confrontation explode into violence, or could the truth finally protect Timothy Grant from yet another battle he never asked to fight?